The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The New York Times did an audio interview with Donald Trump, and it's truly bizarre. And it's starting to get to the point where questions about Trump's mental and emotional stability really sort of can't be ignored. Trump said yesterday in this interview that excerpts of which were released by the New York Times, that he never would have appointed Jeff Sessions to Attorney General if he had known that Jeff Sessions was going to recuse himself from anything Russia related. He called that decision by Jeff Sessions, quote, very unfair to the president, which this entire thing of people being fair to Trump is yet another way in which he's sort of projected the fact that everything he's done really hasn't been fair to anyone, the American people, other elected officials. But I'm sort of digressing from the main point about Jeff Sessions. He said, quote, Sessions should have never recused himself. And if he was going to recuse himself, he should have told me before he took the job, and I would have picked somebody else, which makes absolutely no sense on many levels. Number one, before Jeff Sessions was selected by Donald Trump, I mean, I guess given what appears to be Sessions' involvement, it's possible he could have foreseen how this entire Trump-Russia thing was going to explode. But why would Jeff Sessions have anticipated such a recusal at the very beginning of his selection process? And in addition to that, Sessions really had no choice but to do that. The guy was clearly involved in part of the problem with Trump-Russia, not recusing himself, and Trump probably is too much of a political novice to even realize this. Sessions not recusing himself would probably have caused Trump even more trouble. And Donald Trump said in this interview with the New York Times that it was Sessions' recusal that ultimately led to the appointment of Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller, which is sort of an odd perspective because Trump seems to be operating in a very simplistic world where if B happened after A, it must have been caused by A. While it's true that the special prosecutor was appointed after the recusal of Jeff Sessions, there were endless other factors and reasons that we ultimately ended up with a special prosecutor. And the recusal of Jeff Sessions was only part of the broader Russia question, so to speak. In this same very odd interview with the New York Times, Trump went after not only Jeff Sessions, but also went after fired FBI Director James Comey, saying that Comey tried to leverage a dossier of compromising material in order to keep his job. Bear in mind that this is the same dossier that for a long time Donald Trump claimed didn't even exist. Later, Trump claimed that the contents of the dossier were bogus, despite the dossier's existence being real. But we've seen, since that point, many aspects of that blackmail dossier confirmed. And of course, James Comey didn't put the dossier together. It was put together by former MI6 operative Christopher Steele. But here's the crazy thing. If Donald Trump is criticizing James Comey for wanting to use a dossier of compromising information against Donald Trump, effectively wanting to blackmail Donald Trump, blackmail only works if the dirt you have is true. Trump is effectively incriminating himself here by saying, I don't like that Comey tried to use an incriminating report about me against me to keep his job. Whether or not that's true, that would only even conceivably be a viable strategy if there's actual incriminating information about Donald Trump, and Trump doesn't have the wherewithal and intelligence to realize that by even making this allegation, he's effectively incriminating himself. Donald Trump also criticized in this interview with the New York Times not only Jeff Sessions, not only the fired FBI Director James Comey, but also the acting FBI Director who temporarily replaced James Comey. He also criticized the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein. He slammed Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller and sort of issued like a thinly veiled threat to Mueller. He actually said, if Robert Mueller starts looking at Trump's family's finances above and beyond just Russia-related stuff, that it would cross a red line, which is sort of a threat from the president to the special prosecutor. And this is the guy that supposedly is the most loyal. There's no one more loyal than Trump. He's rebuking Jeff Sessions. The Flynn thing was a disaster. Trump ended up having to force him to resign. But Trump also seems completely disconnected from reality, because he again insisted during this New York Times interview that he's not under investigation. And that ship has long sailed. Trump is quoted in the interview as saying, I don't think we're under investigation. I'm not under investigation. For what? I didn't do anything wrong. That ship has sailed, Donnie Boy. Numerous reports now indicate, and they kind of have for close to 2 months now, that Robert Mueller is investigating Donald Trump, both for his potential role in the collusion or coordination with Russia itself, as well as his role in the cover-up, including potential obstruction of justice. It doesn't seem to me that Donald Trump is even capable of sort of acting in a way that doesn't seem suspicious or erratic. And the question I came away with from listening to excerpts from this New York Times interview is, how was Trump even in that room? Who thought it was a good idea for Donald Trump to be interviewed by the New York Times? And a common trait of total narcissists is that they are super confident in their ability to say anything they want, because they believe anyone I talk to is going to be persuaded by my perspective, and they're going to come away seeing it my way. And that really appears to be affecting Donald Trump here. We know Trump is a terrible legal client, right? He doesn't listen to his lawyers. Lawyers worry that Trump won't even pay them for their work. But this is sort of a new low, going after his own current sitting attorney general and really everybody else. Total lack of personal responsibility. I've said many times over the last 6 months that if the Donald Trump administration were colluding with Russia, it would look a lot like what we're seeing. He starts trying to ease sanctions on Russia on day one of his presidency, constant lying from Trump and his associates about meetings and contacts with Russian actors, quickly tries to return 2 seized Russian compounds to Russia. Back during the campaign, the Trump campaign was able to influence a change in the Republican Party platform with regard to to Russia and Ukraine, that was very favorable to Vladimir Putin. He spilled classified information obtained from an ally of ours, Israel, to Russian diplomats in the Oval Office. And now Donald Trump has done something else that Putin has wanted for a while, but it's actually something that I agree with on policy, although it exposes the further corruption and sort of puppeteering that is going on by Vladimir Putin of Donald Trump. Donald Trump has decided to end a covert program which was arming rebels in Syria fighting against Bashar al-Assad. Now let's break this down into its component parts. Russia and Putin and the Kremlin have wanted the United States to stop helping anti-Assad rebels for a very, very long time. So this decision by Trump plays right into Putin's hands. U.S. officials have confirmed that Russia has been trying to get the U.S. to stop arming anti-Assad rebels for a long time. And now, 6 months into Trump's presidency, apparently a month after Trump initially thought about doing this, and just about 10 days after Donald Trump met with Putin in Germany and talked about the Syria situation, Trump kills the program. Okay. This is the right move. This is the right move. I have been critical of, for a very long time, these picking of sides moves by the United States and the Pentagon, Defense Department, Foreign Policy, CIA, intel agencies, where we are sort of picking sides in the internal battles of other countries. And this has backfired on us many times. It's backfired on us in the Middle East. It's backfired on us in Latin America. I know a lot about that, being from Argentina. And I actually believe that it's a bad idea for the United States to employ these types of policies, and it often ends up with our own weapons being used against us or our allies. I've talked a lot about that. So if you were to come to me and say, David, what's the best thing that Donald Trump has done during his presidency? I would probably say it's this, stopping that program. However, do you think for a second that Donald Trump has any idea about the details and minutia and implications of this? Trump has no idea about anything other than a talking point or two that he might be able to remember for 5 or 10 minutes before he takes the stage somewhere or starts a debate. So while I believe this is the correct decision, and it has nothing to do with who makes it, right? This is, I believe, a good decision. This is yet another item on the list of ways in which Donald Trump is doing everything Vladimir Putin wants. And Trump did this without getting anything in return, at least that we're aware of. Although maybe what he got in return came a few months ago, which was help from Vladimir Putin and Russia and the Kremlin and Russian hackers in helping get him elected in the first place. And I think it's really important. We need nuance, right? This is the right decision. It is not at all indicative of Donald Trump's broader foreign policy perspective or how he sees the U.S. role within geopolitics. There's nothing nuanced here. It's yet another win for Vladimir Putin. And for everybody who keeps saying, if Russia helped Trump, they've gotten nothing out of the deal, you could not be more wrong at this point. Am I missing something here? Let me know. I'm on Twitter at @dpakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. Follow us there. We'll be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Stephen Brooks. We are independent viewer and listener supported media, and it's really been heartwarming and flattering to see the support of people like Stephen and so many others over the last couple of months of the YouTube advertiser boycott and these other calamities that we're dealing with. You can join Stephen at davidpakman.com/membership. We've got a coupon code available for you. It'll save you 40%. That coupon code is IVoted17. You can make pledges if you don't want to deal with the entire apparatus of membership. You can make a pledge of as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/davidpakmanshow. And remember, if you ever buy stuff, things on Amazon, you can support us with your purchases by going to davidpakman.com/Amazon before you shop. Okay, I was checking out the David Pakman Show Reddit discussion forum this morning at davidpakman.com/Reddit. A lot of interest in next week's upcoming interview with host of the Rubin Report, Dave Rubin. You will be able to participate in that interview if you go to our Reddit discussion forum, because we've got a stickied post at the top of the page where I am soliciting questions for Dave Rubin. This is a special thing that we're doing. Next Tuesday, instead of the regular broadcast show where we do 7 stories and a short interview, we will be having the full hour with Dave Rubin, and the bonus show on Tuesday will contain sort of our regular political stories. Over 90 questions so far submitted for Dave Rubin at davidpakman.com/Reddit, and I encourage you to check that out. Also on our Reddit discussion forum, an interesting Reuters article indicating that according to the French president Emmanuel Macron, Donald Trump might reverse his decision on the Paris Climate Accord. That is being reported by Reuters, and there's a discussion about that on our Reddit discussion forum that you can check out. An interesting question posed by a user on Reddit: name an issue that you've moved to the right on. And the user that posted this suggested some areas in which he has moved to the right over time. And it has led to a pretty interesting discussion about how politics can change over time and different issues on which maybe some of our viewers' sensitivities have changed over time. Also on our Reddit discussion forum, a link to a 538.com article about when you can trust a story that uses unnamed sources. And these unnamed or anonymous sources, and they are actually 2 different things. Unnamed meaning sources known to the journalist but not named in the article. Anonymous sources can sometimes be actually sources whose identity is unknown even to the journalist, although the terms are sometimes used interchangeably. That has become a pretty big focus um, even of the Trump administration, and Donald Trump taking a position on media should not be able to use anonymous sources or whatever. Totally clueless and uninformed position, but it's become quite a topic of discussion, and that's a really interesting discussion that's taking place among some in our audience. And lastly, we did on the bonus show earlier this week, we audited producer Pat's claim that he has 1 to 2 cups of coffee a day, because I said, Pat, I've seen that gigantic thermos that you bring in. There's no way that there's only 1 or 2 cups of coffee there. So we actually measured out on the bonus show how many cups of coffee is Pat drinking per day. I won't spoil the results for you, but one of our viewers asking, how many ounces of coffee are in a cup of Freedom of the Press brand brew, 6 or 8, which of course is one of the two. Freedom of the Press and Progressive Wake Up Call are the two roasts of David Pakman Show coffee that are available at davidpakman.com/gear. And a lot of people, the endless controversies around coffee and producer Pat are really starting to wear, I think, on his approval rating. Although I don't believe it will ultimately be a scandal that takes him down. I'm pretty confident in that. Join our discussion forum at davidpakman.com/Reddit. A lot going on there. Nearly 4,000 of our viewers and listeners now participating. Let's talk about Senator John McCain. One of the sort of growing voices of reason in the Republican Party, particularly in the era of Trump, has been Senator John McCain. Now, I don't agree with all of his politics. John McCain was actually one of the louder anti-Obamacare voices back in 2010. He's a Republican, after all, but still, he has been an increasing voice of reason in the Republican Party in the era of Trump. We've now learned that he has brain cancer. This is not John McCain's first cancer diagnosis. He did previously have a melanoma diagnosis. He originally had been treated for a blood clot in his eye, I believe what was the original way that this was reported. And ultimately, it was learned that he has been given a brain cancer diagnosis, and treatment will likely include chemotherapy and radiation, although some of that treatment will have to be delayed because he's still recovering from the eye surgery, and he's suffering from a particularly aggressive form of brain cancer, called a glioblastoma tumor. And if that sounds familiar, you might recall that Senator Ted Kennedy was diagnosed with the same type of brain cancer some years ago, a good friend of Senator John McCain's, and he ultimately lived 15 months after the diagnosis. And the cause of glioblastomas is unknown. There's been speculation about mobile phone radiation, but that's been so far tested and disproven. The idea some types of cancer are familial, which does not mean hereditary, but occur more often in certain familial lines. That seems to be actually quite rare. So there's not an indication right now that there's any kind of strong familial component to this type of brain cancer. And there's been a total outpouring of support for John McCain from both sides of the aisle, generally a well-liked guy, even from the office of Donald Trump, who previously said, you might remember totally disgustingly, that John McCain is not a war hero because he was captured and held as a prisoner of war. One of the most disgusting and vile comments that we heard from Donald Trump during the campaign. Former President Barack Obama tweeting his good wishes for John McCain. And, you know, the good thing is we can all rest assured that all else being equal, John McCain is going to get the best treatment available, the best care available. And I wish that I could say the same for everybody in the country, and sadly I can't. And this is because of the conversation that's going on around the Affordable Care Act and the repeal, and millions of people possibly losing their insurance. It's sad that news like this immediately reminds us of the political battle that the country is engaged in, but maybe it might make someone who wants to make it even harder for people to get the care that they need to reevaluate what they're trying to do in the House or in the Senate, or by getting rid of their state's Medicaid expansion or whatever the case may be. Maybe more people in power will think about the consequences of their actions because of this horrible diagnosis of John McCain. You know, free market and profit, it's fine, right? The movie industry, for-profit industry, have at it. What else? Production of video games or jewelry, make profit off of it. That's fine. But healthcare, I mean, people's care is generating multi-million dollar bonuses for executives. It's generating golden parachutes for health insurance executives. It leads to campaign donations for the elected officials seen as more likely to be friendly to the health insurance industry. And that's a lot of why we're locked into this totally corrupt and immoral for-profit, employer-connected health insurance system. Imagine that you were self-employed and diagnosed with the same thing that Senator John McCain has been diagnosed with, a brain cancer, a form of brain cancer called glioblastoma. But you live in rural Tennessee, and your governor, working with Washington, D.C., is cutting Obamacare subsidies, and there might not be a single insurer offering a non-group plan where you live, and treatment could be $100,000. What do? You don't have Obama tweeting his support to you. You don't have every media outlet talking about your diagnosis and prognosis and about what's going on. You have nothing. And my thoughts are with John McCain and his family, but also all the families that are going through this exact same diagnosis outside of the media spotlight, maybe without the resources that John McCain has, maybe without access to care that John McCain has, and some of them precariously at risk of losing the resources they do have as a result of what our elected officials are thinking about doing. I jokingly told you that in the era of Trump, suddenly everybody's an expert on trade deals and globalization and geopolitics and manufacturing and importing and exporting, whatever. And if that's true, that now everybody knows about trade and all of this stuff, then we should be hearing the complaints very soon about Donald Trump's newly proposed renegotiation of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Trump campaigned on this, right? Trump has been talking for a long time about how NAFTA is bad and he's going to renegotiate it, and TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is bad and Trump is going to get rid of it. Now, it just so happened that by the time Donald Trump was inaugurated in January of 2017, TPP was already dead. It had been dead for months. Back in October of 2016, you had Republicans and Democrats saying, yeah, it's just not going to happen. The U.S. is not going to sign on to TPP. But in any case, Donald Trump still took credit for it when he was inaugurated in January of 2017. The latest is that the White House has now released Trump's proposal for renegotiating NAFTA, and it looks a lot like TPP. It looks a lot like the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal, which Donald Trump said was terrible. It has a ton of provisions that are like the supposedly bad Trans-Pacific Partnership. If you look at the provisions about the regulation of the treatment of workers, it's almost identical to Trans-Pacific Partnership. If you look at the provisions in Trump's new version of NAFTA about the environment and state-owned businesses, it looks just like they ripped a page out of TPP. Trump was against TPP, and now he's proposing something that looks like it has numerous elements that came straight out of TPP. And investors would also have the ability under this investor-state dispute settlement system to go to an extrajudicial court for sort of inter-country disputes, which was one of the main areas of TPP that so many of us and Trump were critical of. And like most Trump proposals, it's so vague that it's almost useless. Democratic Senator Ron Wyden put out a statement about Trump's new renegotiated NAFTA proposal, saying it's, quote, hopelessly vague, and that many of the areas of it look like watered down versions of TPP. Trump claimed that renegotiating NAFTA would be this huge win for the American people. This proposal doesn't achieve that. It has a lot of the same pro-corporate and anti-little guy in the United States provisions that the Trans-Pacific Partnership have. And Trumpists are never going to get how much of a scam this is. And think about the evil genius here. Trump opposed TPP, claimed to get us out of it, even though it was already dead by the time he was inaugurated. And then he delivers a NAFTA renegotiation that includes a ton of the pieces of TPP, and his supporters might actually give him credit for two achievements from his campaign promises: ending TPP, which he didn't, and renegotiating NAFTA for them, even though it's basically a watered-down version of TPP. And the Trumpists will never know, and they will say, look at how much he's getting done. It's amazing. There are some viewers of ours and listeners who get exactly what's going on, and they've started a discussion about it over on our Reddit discussion forum, and you can check that out at davidpakman.com/Reddit. But you know what? If you're participating in a discussion about this on our Reddit discussion forum, you're probably not one of these uninformed Trumpists who believe that this is yet another one of Donald Trump's great victories. It is sad, but this is the type of thing that could bring Trump to re-election in 2020.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
We're continuing our conversation with Tyler Cowen, who's professor of economics at George Mason University, also author of the book The Complacent Class, The Self-Defeating Quest for the American Dream. So in the first part of the interview, we talked about some of the characteristics that allow us to see this complacency that you describe in the book. We also talked a little bit about what has caused it. I want to focus now on the possible impacts and consequences. And at the end of the book, you talk about national security. You talk about a number of other factors that you believe over the long term will be affected by the complacency that you've identified. Let's start there. Over the next 10, 20, 50 years, how will the United States be impacted by this growing complacency that you've described?
Well, let's look at our government. What we find when you examine the federal budget is that each year more and more of it is taken up by expenditures that are locked in. Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid. Now, I'm not at all saying we shouldn't have these programs, but we're taking less and less of tax revenue and devoting it toward research and development, toward discretionary spending, toward infrastructure. We're taking fewer chances. We're spending more and more of our money on just protecting the positions people already have and insulating them from risk. This is very different from what we did, say, in the 1960s, and I feel it's a big mistake. So in the longer run, what will happen is our government is losing the ability to respond flexibly to crises or to come up with the next moonshot or, invent the next big development as it once did with nuclear power. So that to me is very concerning.
And is that, I think we can all imagine how that leads directly into the national security concerns of a country in the sort of stasis that you describe.
That's right. And the notion that America might have to do something where American soldiers suffer casualties, that's become extremely unpopular. We fight wars by drone. And again, in any single instance, that feels maybe comfortable or like the right thing to do. But I worry that we're losing our ability to deter. Our allies do not trust us much anymore. And our influence and projection of power in the world, I see that as going down rapidly.
Yeah, the military thing is an interesting one because we had layer one of sort of the average American being removed from what the military is doing by virtue of not needing a draft here in the United States. You've got an all-volunteer military. So it's very easy for most Americans never to even think about what the military is doing. Now you've got layer two of that removal, which is the increased use of drones and distance warfare. Do you think that that also is part of this sort of comfort bubble that you describe in the book?
Very much so. And arguably the next generation of war will be cyber warfare, which is yet another kind of removal. And I feel when it comes to that, like as long as the internet is working today, we don't see a problem. But we're courting the next 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. And I think at some point there will be a major cyber attack on American assets or institutions, and we're basically not at all ready for that. We just think life is fine now, it can't really happen to us. It's a big mistake.
What do you see in developing countries in terms of factors that cause this complacency not to be there? Is it simply the need for self-preservation and staying alive due to a far reduced standard of living? Are there other more intangible factors?
I think the whole attitude toward risk is very different. So in the book, I give the example of China.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying the U.S. should be like China, but the attitude is, well, if you don't go out and take some chances, risk will come and get you. So people are very proactive and very aggressive. And I think at least at the margin, we should learn something from that. And you see Chinese immigrants, when they come to this country, they do very well. And in part, it's because they're carrying that attitude with them. I would say overall, immigrants are the least complacent people in American society right now.
Yeah, and in the book you also talk about, I mean, not just Chinese immigrants, but and this actually relates a lot to stereotypes that we often hear from elected officials or political pundits or whoever about lazy immigrants leeching off of social welfare programs. The evidence doesn't really back up that caricature, does it?
Correct. And you know, Latinos and Mexicans, Mexican Americans, they're the group most likely to move around the country in search of a new job, far more likely than, say, native-born non-Latino Americans. And that's to their credit. It's very dynamic. It's
now, do you
commendable.
think that that's as a result of them being from particular countries or more related to their status in the United States as new immigrants?
I think the fact that they came here means they're risk takers to begin with. They're accustomed to the idea of moving. They don't find it some unthinkable shock. Obviously, they don't necessarily have strong ties to the first part of the United States they've come to settle in. And if someone says, hey, there's a better job for you in Chicago, I think their attitude is, why not? Let's try it. They can always go back, say, to Mexico or Central America. That's a very healthy attitude.
When it comes to political decisions that are made by whoever's in the White House, whoever's in charge in the House of Representatives or the Senate, are the differences between Democrats and Republicans in terms of how they will impact this broader stasis and complacency even noticeable, or is this an area in which all of our elected officials are quite similar in terms of whether they would even change the status quo you describe?
I think in a funny way, they're quite similar. So anyone who watches politics, you see at the rhetorical level, there has not been so much polarization for a long time. What the Trump people say, the Clinton people say, it all sounds so horrible. They attack each other. But when you get right down to what's likely to happen with the budget, say the failure of the Republicans to roll back Obamacare, whether you agree with that or not, I think we see we're living in a time of stasis where not many things change. And on fundamentals, there's a lot more agreement across the two parties. We're actually just not really going to do very much. The visions of Trump make America great again, very backward looking. Hillary Clinton was backward looking to the 90s and to the Obama administration. A big contrast with, say, JFK, who talked all about the new frontier.
What's an example of the type of policy that a president could actually possibly propose and affect that would change the direction that you identify in the book?
More money for research and development with our infrastructure to get that moving again. And I don't just mean repairing roads and tunnels, though that's fine, but to do something like help implement the smart grid or introduce more online education. We need to make it much easier for poorer people to move into cities, so deregulate building in those cities to some extent. There's a lot we could do. I think the key point is neither party seems that interested in actually doing it. It's a fair amount of talk, but very little action on either side.
Yeah, that may be. I mean, at the same time, what you're talking about, there's no guarantee that we would see it from a Republican or a Democrat, but it certainly sounds to me like something, at least more like the language you'd hear from Democrats, don't you think?
Yes, but keep in mind, Democrats also want to expand a lot of other parts of the budget, entitlement spending, and that will tend to crowd out the possibility of these programs. So, you can debate, which party you prefer or on social issues. But I think in the longer run, it's actually going to look fairly similar once you get past all the rhetoric.
Have you given any thought to the impact of such significant defense spending on the way we more generally allocate resources and the stasis and complacency that you describe, partially from the idea that we could maybe increase complacency by knowing that we've got this massive military industrial complex and that so much money is tied up in bombs and defense and so on and so forth. What's your sense about that?
I think people feel quite safe. They feel, in a sense, too safe. They're neglecting perhaps cyber attack. But what will happen is as we continue to age, it will cost more and more money to sustain people in their older years, which I'm all for doing. But it will mean a lot of pressure on the defense budget, a lot of our capabilities, infrastructure. You see that eroding already. It's been the case for some time. Our Navy getting weaker in relative terms. And that's the likely trend. It's just kind of upkeep and innovation in a lot of areas other than maintaining the elderly. We see those already going down.
You talk about China in the book, as you described, and China's circumstances are quite different than those of the United States. Have you identified any country that is more at the level of development or wealth that is the United States, but that has policies that you would find to be better policies for fighting stasis and complacency?
I think both Canada and Australia have somewhat better policies than we do. Those were countries that were once poorer than America. Now they're each slightly better off and they're better governed. So we could learn some things from them. I would start with those two places. But for the most part, complacency has come to most other wealthy countries.
What about the role of healthcare? I mean, I know it's interesting you mentioned Canada and Australia, both of which were recently ranked in a study of 12 wealthier nations, more developed nations, as having some of the better healthcare systems in terms of their effectiveness. They do not have these sort of employer-connected for-profit healthcare systems of the United States. Does that play a role here?
That plays a role. With respect to America, I think it's one of these you can't get there from here stories. So if we had had better policy, say in 1972, you could imagine American healthcare right now being much cheaper. But given how much we pay, to think that we'll cut those payments to doctors and medical devices and hospitals, it's very hard for me to see that happening. So I think we're stuck in this box where for us, truly universal coverage would be very costly. People demand it. They're not really sure how to get it. People now want more single payer. But in terms of actually footing the bill, I don't think we're close to any kind of consensus.
No consensus, but have you seen some of the analyses, like, for example, by Gerald Friedman at the University of Massachusetts on sort of debunking or attempting to debunk the idea that we can't afford that?
I don't think we can afford it unless the American public would raise its collective hands and say, well, I'm willing to accept a 5%, say, VAT tax on everything I spend. Whether or not they should do that, you can debate. But I don't see any willingness at all to, face up to those costs and say, okay, let's do it. It's all thought of in terms of a free lunch. Like somehow if we have single payer, these costs will magically fall. But Medicare is a kind of single payer for the elderly. That's still a pretty expensive system, much more than what Canada or Australia spends ensuring its elderly.
That's true. Very, very interesting conversation, and I highly recommend the book, which is, of course, The Complacent Class, The Self-Defeating Quest for the American Dream. Economics professor Tyler Cowen is the book's author. Thanks so much for talking to us about this.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
One of the only things worse than repealing Obamacare and replacing it with the American Health Care Act would be just repealing Obamacare. And this is what Donald Trump and a few Republicans have been proposing lately. And it appears as though that proposal is dead. But because of some potentially conflicting comments recently from a couple of the senators that said that they were against a straight Obamacare repeal, we're not yet ready to call it officially dead. So the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, put out a report on what the impact would be, of just repealing Obamacare without any replacement. And it is utterly disastrous. And the one piece from this report that right-wingers are cheering about is that if you were to just repeal Obamacare and not replace it with anything, we would see a decrease in the deficit of $473 billion, over the next 10 years. That's $47 billion per year. This is not even close to enough to make up for the negative externalities that would result from it. But okay, let's forget about that and let's say, hey, you win, you save $47 billion a year, which is sort of a drop in the bucket when you consider the total budget of the United States. What else would happen if there were to be a straight Obamacare repeal? Well, number one, 17 million people would end up without health care just next year. A total of 27 million people would end up without health care by 2020, and a total of 32 million people would end up without health insurance by 2026. Roughly 10% of the current U.S. population would end up without health insurance over the next 10 years if Obamacare is repealed. With an Obamacare repeal, and this is the part that it's out of this world immoral to even think about doing this. With an Obamacare repeal, you would end up seeing about half of the country's population living somewhere with zero insurers participating in the non-group market. In other words, the market for people who, for whatever reason, buy their own health care. By 2020, 75% of the American population would be living somewhere by 2026 where they would not have a single option outside of the group market, meaning through jobs or possibly through some kind of trade organization that they might be members of. So Republicans like to say, we'll repeal Obamacare, people can still buy insurance, just without the subsidies, and they won't be mandated to buy insurance, whatever, it'll be fine. It's not true. Insurers will continue to pull out of areas to the point that in 10 years, if you aren't getting insurance through work or through Medicaid or through Medicare, if you still have those available, 75% of the population would have zero non-group options to just go and say, I want to buy insurance. And this is completely separate from the 25% that would have options, and many would not be able to afford it, because that is a totally separate issue. We're talking now about even having options, and as you know, and as I know, and as most of us understand, just because you have an option doesn't mean that you can afford it. It's like a car dealership that says, we finance everybody. Nobody will be turned away. But depending on your credit and your finances and the car you want to buy, they might say, sure, we've got an option for you, 70% down payment and 30% insurance on the rest of it, which we'll finance for you. Just because you have options doesn't mean that they are real options. So this is a total non-starter for Democrats. It appears as though enough Republicans realize the disaster that a straight Obamacare repeal would be, so that they're not going to do it, but it's not 100% known yet. And back to the negative externalities that I talked about, what a lot of people just don't think about or don't care about or want to pretend doesn't exist is that if 32 million people end up without health insurance, this is going to impact crime. This is going to impact the number of unpaid for emergency room visits, all of which has an effect financially on everybody. This will impact worker productivity. This will destroy entrepreneurial efforts in the United States. If it's going to be that much more difficult for you to have insurance, if you leave your job and go out on your own to do something entrepreneurial, you're way more likely to just stick around in the job you're working at so that you and potentially your family can have health care. So the deficit reduction impact does not consider the negative externalities of 32 million people ending up without insurance. It is an immoral disaster. And like I said earlier, I hope that in the midst of what is tragic news about John McCain's brain cancer diagnosis, I hope more people will realize as a result of that what might happen to millions of people in our country not only if the Affordable Care Act is replaced with the American Health Care Act, but if there's just a straight repeal of the Affordable Care Act. It's to call it sad is a drastic understatement. We have learned that Donald Trump Jr. himself, as well as Jared Kushner and Paul Manafort, will all be testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee next week on the subject of Donald Trump's campaign and possible collusion with Russia. This is a major development, more because it tells us that the investigation is spreading and involving more and more people, not because we're necessarily going to hear stunning things from these three individuals next week. And more often than not, if the person testifying is remotely intelligent and has been properly prepared, they will actually say very little. They'll use a lot of "I just don't recall," I decline to answer. It's very common that what they choose not to answer is sort of the most newsworthy thing, rather than what they do say or answer during some of these hearings. But the big news is the investigation continues to grow and expand. Now, there is no doubt that Jared Kushner is going to be asked about the endless list of foreign contacts that he initially failed to disclose. Unfortunately, Kushner is going to be appearing in closed session. Kushner does have a security clearance, as we've talked about, increasingly under scrutiny, and he is not going to be appearing in a public session. He will only be in a closed session, meaning it's not going to be televised. Trump Jr. and Manafort, if they show up, and we are hoping that they do, are going to testify in open session. Now, Paul Manafort, my guess is, will be well prepared and will say absolutely as little as possible. Donald Trump Jr. doesn't appear to be particularly bright. He doesn't have experience with this type of thing. And I think if anybody might inadvertently self-incriminate, it would be Donald Trump Jr., the same way that his dad often does. The only real way that Donald Trump Jr. could realistically avoid calling more attention to himself would be if he pleads the fifth a lot and just says he doesn't remember a lot of things. And that would still attract attention in other ways, because it would raise suspicions in and of itself. But it might do less damage for him than just kind of speaking extemporaneously and honestly. So I'm predicting a lot of forgetfulness next week. It's going to be really difficult for people to remember who they talked to, who they met with, what was said. But if I had to bet on who might self-incriminate, I would say it's most likely that it would be Donald Trump Jr. Now, there are questions about whether Trump Jr. and particularly whether Paul Manafort will actually show up. Paul Manafort's representatives have been asked, will he appear? And they haven't commented definitively so far. It is also leaked that at one point, Paul Manafort was $17 million in debt to Russia. So he is a guy who is sort of acutely at the center of this thing. And I hope that they all appear. This is increasingly becoming a follow the money thing. And there's a really interesting article that I bookmarked. I haven't read it fully yet, but I skimmed it in Vox, which says to really understand what's going on with Trump Russia, it's actually useful to put aside the Putin part of it. Putin may or may not be a player. But if you go at it from the angle of following the money and money laundering, which is a bigger and bigger part. Sorry, I just hit my microphone. A bigger and bigger part of this thing, that following the money and money laundering is ultimately what might expose the truth about Trump-Russia collusion. So it's going to be a major week next week. And fortunately, we are here the entire week next week, and we'll have full coverage for you. We talked yesterday about a Saudi woman being arrested for wearing a miniskirt. We've since learned that she has been released without charges as of right now. I got a call yesterday from a Saudi woman on our voicemail line, which is 2192-DAVID-P, a Saudi woman who said, it's actually worse than you even imagine in Saudi Arabia. Take a listen to this.
Hi, David. I'm a female from Saudi Arabia, and I was just watching your segment about the woman that got arrested for wearing a skirt. I've been living in the United States for over 10 years now, and my name is R.A. I'm not going to give my full name because that's not smart being from Saudi Arabia. And I thank you for bringing that issue up. The reality is much worse than you think. Growing up there was a really challenging time, and it shaped me in a way that I wouldn't really take back, but I do not need to be a warrior to reach my potential. So thank you for bringing it up, and keep it up. You have a great show.
Thank you. Thank you. Really appreciate that. And, you know, when you have such a closed system, it's not surprising that what we hear about is only a fraction of the total of what there is to hear about. We've got a tremendous bonus show for you today. The White House yet again continues to bungle people's names. We have a member of India's lowest caste expected to be elected president, and NASA wanted to talk about science, and a congressman wanted to ask instead about Martian civilizations. We've got a fantastic bonus show. Get instant access to the bonus show by signing up at davidpakman.com/membership. I'll speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.